And I want you to kind of use your imaginations a little bit this morning. Let's imagine that we all get to live for at least 80 years, okay? I don't know if that's the average amount of lifespan of a human being, but let's just imagine all of us in this room get to live for about 80 years. And for every week that we are alive for those 80 years, so for every week, we receive a marble. I've got some marbles in a jar here. So like, if you imagine for every week of your life for 80 years, you receive a marble. That would mean you would get about 4,000 marbles. And that's way more than what I've got in this jar here. Apparently, I've got 50 marbles in this jar, okay? So way more than what's in this jar here. And so you've got these 4,000 marbles, and that kind of sounds like a lot, doesn't it? It sounds like a lot until you think like, well, every week that passes by in your 80 years, you lose a marble, okay? You lose one of your marbles each week. And so you think, well, I've got 4,000, that's okay. I can cope with 4,000 marbles. But, you know, by the time you reach your 30th birthday, 1,500 marbles would be gone, okay? And by the time you're in your 50s, more than half of your marbles are gone, which is kind of where I'm heading. And so as each week goes by, whether you notice it or not, another marble is gone forever. You don't get it back. And here's the thing, what matters is not how many marbles you've got left. But actually, what matters is what you do with the ones that are still in your hands. Will they just slip through your fingers unnoticed? Or will we use them intentionally to love and to serve and to make a difference in the world? My point's this, we all have a kind of finite amount of time to make our mark in history, to make a dent in the world, to be the person and to do the thing that God has called us to do in the time that is allowed us. And the reality is, without trying to be super morbid, once that time is gone, it's gone. So whatever impact we have, whatever impact we have in the time that we have, eventually that will pass and we have to give it to another generation. And then they're left to make their mark in the world and their dent in history. So this morning we're going to start a new series. And this is something we do every September, where we attempt to kind of unpack like a facet of our vision as a church. And really what we're doing there is we're saying this is what we believe God has called us to be as a community. This is who God has called us to be as a church. And for the last 3 years, well, it was 3 years ago this week that Tammy and I moved to the city to plant this church. And so we moved with our girls. We gave up our church that we were leading and our jobs, our home where we'd lived, in Northampton for like 16 plus years. And we moved here to the city to start this community. And, when we did that, we began to imagine the kind of church what it might look like, what it could be. And we felt God wanted to start. God began to paint a picture on our hearts of and for those who would join us, what is it we're going to do? What's the specific thing in the time that God has allowed us? What's that thing that He's called us to do? And in many ways, vision is how we see ourselves as a church in the context of the city. How we might make our mark, how we make our dent in the world. To use kind of biblical language, vision is kind of like that dream that we have where we're attempting to say, how are we going to fulfill the Great Commission? Jesus gives his disciples this commission at the end of Matthew's gospel. He says to go and make disciples of all nations. And so when we're thinking about vision, we're ultimately saying, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that in our context and in the time that's allotted to us right now? And so that's what we want to lean into in this series. I want to take the next 3 Sundays to think about what does it mean to have a theology of place? What does it mean to be a people rooted in a place? And what does that mean for us to be a church that's for our city? Now, if we're going to be a church for our city, it might be helpful to think about how, as a church, and I mean universally, how the church can view the city. And I actually think churches can view the city in a number of different ways. Firstly, there are churches who can view the city with apathy. Churches can have a sort of apathetic view of the city. And I would call those churches that are in the city. They're just in the city. There are more than 100 churches across Milton Keynes, hundreds more across our region. And I would say there's a good majority of them that really could just classify themselves as a church that's simply in the city or town or village they find themselves in. They're located geographically in a place, but because they view the people of their city and they view the city itself with apathy, they make very little impact on those around them. And I'm not saying that to be mean or even critical. It's just an observation that our city, our region, our country even is full of churches who for whatever reason exist with this kind of apathetic sort of nature towards their city, town, or location. Maybe you've been in or visited a church like that. They're just simply a church in the city. The second kind of church, and maybe you grew up in a church like this, and that church whose attitude towards the city is it's more like animosity. Unlike the first church, they're not so apathetic towards the city they're in, but they are more kind of like despising of the city they're in. I'd call this church a church that's against the city. They're not just in it, but they're actually against it. The mindset of churches like this is that the people in the church are good and the people out there in the city are bad. That the people of the church are right and the people of the city are wrong or evil and they need to be punished in some way. Believe it or not, there are a lot of churches with that mentality. I grew up in one. And what happens is people in churches like that, they tend to isolate themselves from the culture of the city around them, partly for self-preservation, partly because they don't want to get infected by those bad people outside, and partly so they can look down on the city with disgust. Okay? And so they can be like that. That's the church that's against the city. The third kind of church, and this is a church that I think is becoming more and more prevalent in our culture. And they don't have animosity towards the city. They're not apathetic towards the city, but instead they seek to imitate the city. They view the city as something they need to imitate. I'd call this kind of church a church that's of the city, where they want to look like the city. They want to feel like the city. They want to act like the city. And when we first hear that, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And there are parts of that mentality that are right. But the problem is, in our attempts to imitate the city and be relevant to the city, those churches are live in danger of being assimilated into the culture of the city, and they stop looking like Christians. They stop looking like the people of God, and where they start to bend towards the culture. They stop being like salt and light in the culture. They look so much more like the secular city than their ability to speak truth into a secular city. You see, we can't just be a church that's of the city. There's got to be a difference, isn't there, between darkness and light, even when we attempt to love our city and love it well. And so I would argue that those three attitudes that I've just described are actually wrong biblically. Then none of them are a position that the church should take. So we're not going to be a church that's just in the city. There's lots of them already. And we're definitely not going to be a church that's against the city. And I think the passage that we're going to look at this morning kind of makes that clear, that that isn't a helpful position. And we're not going to be a church that's of the city, because even though we want to love our city and we want to do that well, we still want to be like salt and light. We still want to be a different kind of people in the midst of it. So if you've got a Bible, and it's always good to bring a Bible to church, and none of this digital rubbish on your phone, like a real Bible, like one of these. We're going to be in Jeremiah 29, and I can't actually read my Bible without my glasses, but we will attempt to. What the problem I have is I've reached that age where I need glasses to read, but then I put them down and you all go funny. So yeah, but we're going to be in Jeremiah 29, and this passage, which I'm sure some of us are familiar with, gives us a kind of biblical basis for what it looks like, I think, to be a fourth kind of church. Not just a church that's against the city, definitely not a church that's sort of apathetic or anything like that, or wanting to kind of just imitate the city, but what it means to be a church for the city. So let me give you some context into this passage. The people of God, the Israelites, they have been in a moment where they are kind of rebelling against God, which is kind of their nature. It's kind of, if you read the Old Testament, it's kind of the pattern of behavior of God's people. They're constantly and repeatedly rebelling against God. And God, in his nature, continually attempts to woo them back. It's continually is trying to call them back to himself by his grace, but they keep running. They keep turning their back on God. And eventually they kind of find themselves bowing down to other gods and giving themselves to other things. And finally, God brings his judgment upon them. And he raises up another nation of people, the Babylonians, and he sends them into Israel and to destroy the city and to take the people they don't kill captive into exile. And what God does is he speaks to the prophet Jeremiah, and he begins to say, here is how I want you to act whilst you find yourself captive in a foreign city. And he makes clear that the captivity itself was his doing, that it was God who raised up the Babylonians to go in and take the Israelites into exile. And God says, here's how I want you to act towards those evil people. Here's how I want you to treat them. Here's how I want you to relate to them whilst you are captive in the city. So Jeremiah 29 and verses 4. I haven't got it written down in my notes. Verses 4. Yes, it is verse 4. It says this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I've carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Now imagine you are taken captive into a pagan city. And whilst you're there, God says, I don't want you to decrease, I want you to increase. And what God does, I think, is he tears down this idea that we're supposed to assimilate in some way and lose our identity as his people. And the reason why he does that is because the Babylonians were really sneaky. Okay? What the Babylonians did, they would go in and invade another nation, another group of people, and they would kill a bunch of people, but then those that remained, they would pick them up and take them back to Babylon. And actually, when they brought them back to Babylon, they would actually let them live quite comfortably. They would live in nice neighborhoods. They would have good jobs. Some of them even had like official jobs, really important things in government and things like that. And the idea is this: instead of taking over a nation by killing them all, the idea was that they were going to assimilate these people into Babylonian culture. And so suddenly, 2 or 3 years later, living in exile, there would be no more Israelites because they'd all become Babylonians. And that's what happens, when we meet characters in the Old Testament like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When we meet those guys, they're resisting that moment where Babylon's saying, we want to assimilate you. We want to make you like us. And the thing is, if we assimilate into the culture of our city, we can no longer tell the difference between us and a lost world. There's no difference at all. And I think God would say to us, stop being people who are just wanting to retreat back into darkness, wanting to retreat back into the way our city functions. God says we're called to be children of light, doesn't he? He calls us into the light. So I love the message interpretation of Jesus' words in Matthew 5. He says, here's a way to put it. You are here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. We're to be those kinds of people, regardless of the environment around us. So Jeremiah 29, verse 5, he says, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, so they too have sons and daughters, increase in number there, do not decrease. In other words, maintain your identity and multiply it. Keep your identity as Israelites in Babylon and make sure you continue to multiply. And then he says this, he says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see, what God doesn't say is, I want you to escape the city that you've been taken into exile of. He doesn't say to them as his people, I want you to hate the city that has killed your family and brought you into exile. He doesn't say, I want you to look down on the city that's brought you into exile. God says, I want you to pray for it. And don't just pray. Don't just stop there. God says, I want you to seek. I want you to pursue. I want you to go after the welfare of the city, this place that I've pulled you into exile of. The word peace in the passage there is the Hebrew word shalom. If any of you have watched Friday Night Dinner, you will know That's a magical word. But shalom is the Hebrew word there. God says, I want you to seek the shalom of a pagan city. Now, the word shalom means more than just the kind of removal of hostility between two groups of people. Now, that would have been a radical thing in itself. Imagine God saying to you, I know these people have killed your husband and they've taken you and your children into captivity, but just be at peace with them. That would be a radical thing for God to say to you, but that's not really what he's saying. What he's saying is even more radical than that. God is saying, seek the universal flourishing of the city. He says, I want you to go into the city that took you captive, destroyed your life, and I want you to pray for it. I want you to pursue the universal flourishing of the city. And here's the thing, I believe that principle that God called his people to back then is a principle that he implores us to have today, that we're to have that same posture towards the city. And I believe God wants us, as one of his many expressions of his church in this city, to be a church for the city. And in being for this city, he wants us, he calls us, he invites us to seek the universal flourishing of the city. And so in many ways, this passage is kind of like a foundational scripture for us as a church. Foundational in the sense that it kind of answers the question, what kind of church do we want to be in this place? Because what God was saying to those Israelites then, I believe he's saying to us now. Saying, I don't want you to be a people that are just in the city. I don't want you to be a people who are aren't making an impact because you're too apathetic and too busy doing your own thing. That's not God's heart for the church. God's not saying, hey, I want you to be against the city. And he's not saying that. He's not saying just build holy huddles and critique and pass judgment from a distance. And he's not saying he simply wants us to be of the city. Yes, we want to be relevant, but we want to be relevant because God's hand's on us, not because we're trying to be cool, okay? But that God's hand is upon us. That's why we want to be relevant. And so we're not supposed to just be of the city. But the thing that God has called us to do is to be a church and a people who are for the city, for his name and for his glory. And what I think that means is actually fairly simple. I think as we live our lives, as we make the most of the marbles in our jar, as we seek to make our impact, as we seek to make our mark and step into Jesus's commission of his church, what I think that means is it's a mindset shift for all of us. That as we walk with Jesus, that we don't look at the city as something that's here for us to take from. And although we would never admit that, or even perhaps consciously consider it, the truth is our view of the city can often be, what can I take from it? What can I consume? And we don't really see ourselves as being here for the city's welfare. Rather, the city is here for our welfare, for our benefit. And this passage invites us to have a complete change in the way that we view the city. And actually, we are to think about the city as a place that God has put us for very intentional reasons. In the book of Acts, it actually says that God set our allotted time in this life, and God set our boundaries of our inhabitation. He he set them in motion. And that means that God specifically, before the foundations of the world, looked at you and me and he said, I'm choosing you to be right here, to be in this place at this very time. God handpicked you to be right where you are right now. The question that raises, or at least it does for me, is why? Why would God do that? God, if you've specifically chosen me to be in this city at this particular time in history, what does that mean? What is it that you want me to do for your glory, for your sake, here and now at this time? Well, if you're an employee, a number of us in this room are employees. I think that means being the best employee you can possibly be. It means not just seeing our jobs as a means to an end, but actually doing something, however menial we might think it is, for the good of the city. It means those of us who are in business, your business plan doesn't just include the flourishing of your family and your business, but as businessmen and women who are called to follow Jesus, you're to ask the question, God, you have me in this city at this time. How do you want me to do business? How do you want me to treat my staff and my employees? How do you want me to take care of my customers? It means if you're an artist or a musician, it means that you don't just go out and make great music or great art for the sake of great music and great art, but you make great art and music to be the shalom of the city, for his name, for his glory, and for the sake of the gospel. It means if you're a parent or if you're a teacher, if we're a church that's for the city, it means that we don't go out there to fight for good schools just so our kids can have good schools to go to. But we go out and we serve those schools so that our city has good schools for his name, for his glory, and for the gospel. One of the greatest examples of this in church history was a guy called Charles Spurgeon, who led the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London back in the 1850s. The Metropolitan Tabernacle was a church that loved the city. At the time, Victorian London was experiencing a huge amount of industrialization. People were leaving the farms and the villages by their thousands and pouring into the city. And as a result of that, the population of the poor and the orphans and the widows were going through the roof in the city of London. And as a result of that population growth, particularly amongst the poor, a lot of churches did what churches do. They relocated to the rich suburbs. Okay? So a number of the churches, as more and more poor people moved into the city, they all retreated to the suburbs. But Spurgeon and the Metropolitan Tabernacle had a question, and that was, what kind of church are we going to be? Are we going to be just a church in our city? Is it all just going to be about us? Are we going to be a church that's against our city? Are we simply going to look down on these poor people who are coming into London and changing everything for the worse? Or are we going to be a church that's just of our city, where we're not going to be salt and light, we're not going to change anything? Or are we going to be a church that's for the city? And that's what they said yes to. They said, yes, we're going to be a church for the city. And so they didn't escape to the suburbs like all the rest, but they stayed right in the middle of the chaos. And besides from having a church that was full to capacity every Sunday, they built over a dozen low-income homes where people could come who were arriving into the city, and whilst they found their feet, they had a place to stay until they found a job. After this, they also did this. They also built 17 fully funded homes for the elderly. Back then, there was no social care or end-of-life care. And so if you didn't have family that could take care of you, that was it. Game over. You died. And so they built these homes for the elderly so they could take care of them and they could die with dignity. One of the coolest things they did was they built an orphanage. They built an orphanage that housed and clothed and educated 400 orphans. Now you might hear that and think, well, that's not that many. But do you know how many children are in the social care system in our city? There's actually 482. 482 children in our city in the social care system. And so this one church, this group of people that actually grew to about 5,000 in attendance, they raised their hand and they said, you know what? The orphan problem in the city, we'll take them all. We'll take them all. Just send them our way. Just one church made of people just like you and me. They raised their hands and said, we're in. But here's what happened. Not only did they begin to influence the poor in the city, but they also began to influence the rich. And they gained the ear of the British aristocracy. And slowly but surely, those 5,000 people began to change the culture of the city of London. As they impacted the city emotionally, socially, and economically. It was said that if the Metropolitan Tabernacle was to close their doors, the secular city of London would have grieved. The loss of that church in that city would have been felt by the city. I don't know about you, but I want to go to a church like that. I want to be part of a church community that is like that. I want to be part of a church where, yes, God is worshipped, the gospel is preached, people meet Jesus. I want to do all of those things. But at the same time, I want to be part of a church where the people of the church don't just huddle together in cozy little ghettos, but actually they leave the four walls of the church and they go and bless and love and serve the city around them in the name of Jesus. You know, we've spent the last 3 years building this church really from the bottom up. And we've done that relationally. We've gathered people. And over time, you know, we've gone from like a handful of people sitting around our dining room table 3 years ago to about 120, 130 adults and kids who would say, particularly if you paid them, that Garden City was their church home. And the language that we've been using the last number of years is that we are kind of building like this beachhead. You know, we're trying to amass enough resources so that we can go and be all that we are meant to be in the city. Amen? That's what we've been saying repeatedly over the last number of years. And, you know, I believe that as we step into this whole new season, as we learn again what it means to have that kind of right posture towards our city, that it's a season for us as a church to make our mark. It's a season for us as a church to make our dent in the fabric of our city. Not because we want to be the best church in the city. Okay? I'm not interested in being the best church. I want us to be the best church for our city. So we can be the best church we can possibly be for the sake of our city. And so as we step into this next season as Garden City Vineyard, could we build a legacy so strong that if for some reason we no longer existed, our city would notice? Our city would feel it. A legacy where our presence is unmistakable. A legacy where lives are changed. A legacy where children are put into families. a legacy where the impact is so real, our city would rise up and say, we miss them. Where did they go? What happened? I don't know if you can have an imagination for them. But I think that's the kind of measurable statistics that are worth measuring. You know, we count a lot of things in church. We count how many of you show up on a Sunday, how many of you go to small groups during the week, and it kind of helps us plan. It helps us think about what we need to do maybe in 6 months' time if these things carry on growing and developing and all of those sorts of things. But you know what? They're just numbers. They're just numbers. They're often, we say they're bums on seats. But actually, a real measurable thing, a real lasting difference is that we're called to make a difference in our city. We're called to shape and change our city. And so that's the journey that I want us to go on. As we step into this new season, as we inhabit this new venue, which I'm slightly worried that we might run out of space in, as we inhabit this space and we turn our face towards the city, what might that look like in the months and weeks and years ahead? Amen? Gone on for too long. So if you're able to, why don't we stand and we'll just quickly pray.